The Xylos Interstellar Academy stood as a beacon of knowledge across the galaxies, its gleaming spires and floating lecture halls home to students from thousands of different worlds. Located in a perfectly neutral gravitational zone, the Academy prided itself on its accommodations for all species, from the silicon-based life forms of Andromeda to the energy wave entities from the Crab Nebula. In the comparative species biology classroom, Alara Vance straightened her uniform and tried to focus. As the only human exchange student currently attending the Academy, she'd grown accustomed to being the odd one out, but that didn't make it any easier. The classroom itself was a marvel of adaptive technology. Chairs that morphed to accommodate any body type, holographic displays that adjusted to different visual spectrums, and a universal translation system that somehow managed to convey complex biological concepts across vastly different language structures. Professor Kthar, an imposing reptilian being with compound eyes and scales that shifted colors with his emotions, was in the middle of a particularly intense lecture on evolutionary adaptations to different gravitational environments. His scales had taken on a deep purple hue, indicating his excitement about the topic. And so we see that species evolving in high-gravity environments tend to develop dense, compact body structures. He hissed, his voice translated perfectly by the small device at Alara's ear. While those from low-gravity worlds often exhibit. Alara realized she needed her reference text. She'd forgotten to activate her digital copy, and the physical book sat in her bag at her feet. She waited for a pause in the professor's rapid-fire delivery and stood up. Crack! The sound, sharp and dry, echoed through the classroom like a gunshot. Professor Kthar froze mid-sentence, his compound eyes swiveling to lock onto Alara. The purple of his scales instantly shifted to a startled yellow. The entire class fell silent, and 27 pairs of various types of sensory organs turned toward her in perfect unison. Alara stood frozen, suddenly conscious of being the center of attention. Next to her, her lab partner Zorp, a translucent Zorpian whose jellyfish-like body pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, had recoiled, pulling his tentacles in defensively. Your supporting structure, Zorp whispered, the patterns on his body flashing in distress. Has it fractured? Alara looked down at herself, momentarily confused. Then realization dawned, followed by embarrassment. Oh, no, I'm fine, she said quickly. That was just my knees. They make that sound sometimes when I stand up. It's completely normal. The silence deepened. If anything, her explanation seemed to make things worse. Professor Kthar's scales had shifted to a concerned orange. Normal, he repeated, the translation carrying a distinct tone of disbelief. Your endoskeletal support joints regularly produce fracture-mimicking acoustics during standard mobility functions. From the back of the room, a Grinshaw student with a chitinous exoskeleton clicked its mandibles nervously. Is the human experiencing catastrophic structural failure? It asked, the universal translator somehow conveying both scientific curiosity and horror. No, really, I'm fine, Alara insisted, feeling her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Human knees just do that sometimes. It's just air bubbles in the synovial fluid. Nothing's broken. Professor Kthar approached her desk, his movements cautious, as if he feared she might collapse at any moment. Perhaps you should explain this normal physiological phenomenon to the class, he suggested, though it was clearly more of a command than a request. It appears to be an excellent learning opportunity regarding human biology. Alara swallowed hard. She wasn't prepared to give an impromptu lecture on the questionable engineering of human knee joints, but the entire class was now watching her with expressions ranging from concern to fascination to what appeared to be mild disgust. Well, she began, human joints are lubricated by synovial fluid, and sometimes gas bubbles form in this fluid. When we move certain ways, these bubbles can pop or shift, creating that sound. Some humans also have tendons that slip over the joint structures, making similar noises. It's called crepitus in medical terms, and it's usually harmless. A ripple of murmurs spread through the classroom. One student, a Kelnari with 6 limbs and a body covered in iridescent feather scales, raised a limb. But would such sounds not indicate imminent structural collapse on your homeworld? How do your predators not locate you immediately? This launched a wave of similar questions. Is the phenomenon painful? Does your species simply accept this obvious design flaw? Are human joints meant to be disposable? How frequently must humans be repaired? Alara felt overwhelmed. What had been a simple, embarrassing bodily function was rapidly turning into an interspecies incident. She noticed Professor Kthar had taken out a small recording device and was muttering notes into it, his scales now a curious shade of blue-green. It's really not a big deal, she tried to explain. Lots of human joints make these noises, especially as we age. We just kind of ignore it. Fascinating, Professor Kthar said, the scales around his neck ridge flaring slightly. The human species has normalized potential structural warning signals, a remarkable psychological adaptation to compensate for physical limitations. He turned to address the class. This offers us an excellent segue into our next topic, psychological adaptations to physical vulnerabilities across species. Alara slowly sank back into her seat, wishing she could disappear. She'd only wanted to get her textbook, not become the day's case study. Next to her, Zorp had cautiously extended a tentacle in what she'd come to recognize as a gesture of support. Your kind is more resilient than appearances suggest, he whispered, his bioluminescent patterns pulsing in what she'd learned was a sign of friendliness. Alara managed a small smile. Thanks, Zorp. We have to be. The rest of the class passed in a blur of embarrassment for Alara, as Professor Kthar repeatedly used her fascinating joint acoustics as a reference point for various evolutionary discussions. By the time the class ended, she was certain that her knees had become the most discussed human anatomical feature in the history of the Academy. As students filed out of the classroom, she noticed many of them casting curious glances her way, a few even altering their paths to avoid walking too close to her, as if her condition might be contagious. Or worse, her limbs might spontaneously detach. Zorp stayed by her side, his translucent body showing patterns of concern. They will forget soon, he assured her. Last semester, everyone was equally fascinated when they discovered that Trevelyan students shed their outer membranes during final exam week. Alara appreciated his attempt at comfort, but she had a sinking feeling that this wouldn't blow over quickly. She'd been working so hard to blend in at the Academy, to represent humanity as capable and dignified members of the galactic community. And now she was the human with the crunchy skeleton. Her suspicions were confirmed the very next day. As she entered the Academy's central atrium, a vast, zero-gravity space where students from all environments could comfortably gather, she immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. Conversations paused as she passed by. A group of Krillian students with crystalline exoskeletons visibly stiffened, quite literally, as their mineral-based bodies could shift from flexible to rigid states. Alara joints sound. One of them whispered, not quietly enough to escape her translator. She quickened her pace, head down, only to nearly collide with a tall, spindly arachnoid student who skittered backward with alarming speed. Careful with your fragile calcium supports, the arachnoid cautioned, waving 4 of its 8 limbs in what could have been concern or mockery. By midday, Alara had heard variations of crunchy human and skeleton noise more times than she could count. It seemed news of her condition had spread throughout the Academy overnight. Even professors in her other classes seemed to watch her movements with newfound interest, as if expecting her to collapse into a pile of fractured bones at any moment. During the communal meal period, she found herself sitting alone until Zorp's familiar luminescent form pulsed into view, settling across from her. The gossip networks are quite active regarding your joint acoustics, he said, his speech patterns always refreshingly direct. Many species are expressing concerns about human structural integrity in general. Alara sighed, pushing her nutrient-balanced meal around its container. Great. I've single-handedly convinced the entire Academy that humans are walking structural disasters. Not single-handedly, Zorp corrected, missing her sarcasm. Your phenomena involves your knee joints, not your hands. Despite her mood, Alara found herself smiling. Zorp's literal interpretations were somehow comforting in their consistency. I just wish I could make them understand it's normal, she said. It's like they've never encountered a species with a quirk before. Perhaps that is the approach, Zorp suggested, his colors shifting to a thoughtful blue. Every species has biological peculiarities. The Hevlerans can detach their sensory stalks. The Phosphorians emit light when stressed. My kind can liquefy temporarily to pass through small spaces. Yes, but those all sound useful, Alara countered. My knees just make weird noises and sometimes hurt when it rains. Before Zorp could respond, a message flashed across both their personal devices. Alara read it with a growing sense of dread. Attention! Student Alara Vance is requested to report to the Academy Medical Center for a comprehensive physiological assessment. Authorization, Dr. Glargan, Chief Xenobiological Health Officer. This can't be happening, Alara groaned. They're actually concerned enough to call me in for medical evaluation? Zorp's patterns shifted to what Alara had come to recognize as his equivalent of a shrug. Dr. Glargan is known for his thoroughness and caution, and occasional overreactions to new biological phenomena. It's not a phenomena, it's just noisy knees. But protests were futile. Academy regulations were clear. Medical evaluations were non-negotiable when initiated by the chief health officer. The Academy Medical Center occupied an entire floating dome at the edge of the campus. Its interior a bewildering array of environments designed to accommodate the medical needs of hundreds of different species. Dr. Glargan, a towering, six-limbed being with silvery skin and multiple sets of eyes arranged in a ring around what passed for his head, met Alara in what was designated as the oxygen breather moderate gravity examination area. Student Vance. He greeted her, his voice emerging from a small translation device at his central torso. I understand you are experiencing skeletal acoustic events. I'm really not experiencing anything unusual, Alara tried to explain. Human knees sometimes make popping sounds. It's perfectly normal. Dr. Glargan's multiple eyes blinked in unnerving sequence. Normal is a relative concept across species. What is normal for one may be catastrophic for another. We must establish baseline parameters for human joint function. What followed was 3 hours of the most comprehensive physical examination Alara had ever endured. She was scanned by devices she didn't recognize, had samples taken of everything from her blood to her synovial fluid, and was asked to perform a series of increasingly specific movements, while various machines recorded her joint functions from every conceivable angle. Throughout the process, Dr. Glargan maintained a clinical detachment, occasionally muttering observations to his recording device. Human knee joint shows remarkable inefficiency in design, tendency toward premature wear even in young specimen, surprisingly limited range of motion compared to similar bipedal species, evidence of minimal self-repair mechanisms. By the time he finished, Alara felt less like a student and more like a particularly disappointing science experiment. Well, she asked as Dr. Glargan reviewed the results on a floating holographic display. Am I going to survive? Dr. Glargan's eyes rotated slowly to focus on her. Your attempt at humor through exaggeration is noted, he said. According to our analysis, your joint sounds are indeed, as you claimed, a common variation within human physiological parameters. They appear to be caused by gas release within the synovial fluid and occasional tendon displacement across the patella. So, I'm fine. Like I said, fine is imprecise, Dr. Glargan corrected. Your skeletal structure shows the typical weaknesses inherent to your species. Calcium-based materials with inadequate self-healing properties and joints that appear to be designed with planned obsolescence. However, there is no immediate danger of catastrophic failure. Alara wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or insulted. Great. So can I go now? You are clear to return to regular activities, Dr. Glargan confirmed. However, I would like to consult with Professor Kthar about this phenomenon. The educational potential is significant. Please don't make this a bigger deal than it is, Alara pleaded. Science is never concerned with the magnitude of deals, Dr. Glargan replied enigmatically. Only with understanding. Alara left the medical center with a clean bill of health, but a growing sense of dread about what this newfound scientific interest in her joints might mean for her social life at the academy. Her fears were realized the very next day when she discovered that Professor Kthar had organized an impromptu lecture session titled Structural Adaptations and Limitations Across Species, a case study in human joint acoustics. Worse still, she was expected to attend as the primary subject of discussion. The lecture hall was packed with students from across the academy, not just those enrolled in comparative biology. Alara slouched in her seat, tried to make herself as inconspicuous as possible, while Professor Kthar and Dr. Glargan displayed three-dimensional holographic models of human knee joints to the assembled crowd. As you can observe, Professor Kthar was saying, his scales a vibrant shade of academic excitement. The human joint design represents an evolutionary compromise. While allowing for upright locomotion and tool manipulation, it sacrifices durability and introduces these fascinating acoustic side effects. Dr. Glargan indicated a particular section of the floating joint model. The synovial cavity contains fluid that can form gaseous bubbles under certain conditions. When mobility occurs after periods of stasis, these bubbles may collapse, creating the sound that many of you found so alarming. A Trilaxian student with a crystalline sensory crest raised an appendage. But why would evolution select for such an inefficient design? An excellent question, Professor Kthar responded, his scales rippling with approval. Human evolution prioritized energy efficiency and heat regulation in their original environment. The joint design, while imperfect, required less metabolic energy to maintain than more robust alternatives. Another student, a silicon-based life form from a high-gravity world, vibrated in what Alara had learned was their equivalent of raising a hand. Is this why humans have such brief lifespans? Their structural components simply wear out. Alara couldn't take it anymore. She stood up abruptly, her knees making another audible pop that caused several nearby students to flinch. That's not. She began, then took a deep breath. Look, yes, human joints aren't perfect, but we've adapted. We've built civilizations, explored space, created art and music and literature, all with these supposedly defective bodies. Maybe our joints make funny noises sometimes, but that doesn't make us fragile or defective. The lecture hall fell silent. Professor Kthar's scales shifted to a thoughtful blue-green. Dr. Glargan's ring of eyes blinked in sequence. An impassioned defense, Professor Kthar finally said, and one that raises an interesting perspective on adaptation and compensation. Perhaps there is something to be said for a species that accepts its physical limitations and finds ways to transcend them. The moment might have been a turning point, if not for what happened next. The academy-wide announcement system chimed, and a message scrolled across the holographic displays throughout the lecture hall. Attention, all students. The Multi-Environmental Survival Techniques Practical Assessment will commence tomorrow. All participants must report to Simulation Dome 3 at first rotation. Proper precautions will be taken to ensure safety across all physiological types. Alara felt a chill run through her. The MES Practical was notorious for its physical challenges, designed to test students' ability to survive in environments drastically different from their native conditions. For most species, it was demanding but manageable. For a human with inefficient joints in an alien environment, Zorp must have sensed her concern, because his bioluminescent patterns flashed in what she'd come to recognize as reassurance. "You will perform adequately," he said. "The simulations are calibrated to each species' capabilities." "That's just it," Alara whispered back. If they've been listening to Professor Kthar and Dr. Glargan, they probably think humans can barely walk without falling apart. Her concerns proved prophetic. When she arrived at Simulation Dome 3 the next day, she was immediately approached by the course instructor, a gruff Taurian with a bullish appearance that somehow managed to convey both military precision and academic authority. "Student Vance," The instructor rumbled, consulting a floating data screen. "I've been advised of your structural peculiarities. We've modified your assessment parameters accordingly." "My what?" Alara asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Your joint acoustics and potential fragility issues," the instructor clarified. "Your route has been adjusted to minimize gravitational stress and impact demands." Alara felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "I don't need special accommodations," she insisted. "I'm perfectly capable of completing the standard assessment." The instructor's bovine features arranged themselves into what might have been skepticism. "Medical recommendations are not optional, Student Vance. You will follow the modified route." She wanted to argue further, but other students were arriving, including a group of Krillians who had been among the most vocal about her supposed fragility. Their crystalline bodies glinted as they exchanged what were clearly amused glances. "Look, the brittle-jointed human is getting the easy path," one of them commented, their translator making no attempt to mask the mockery. Alara clenched her fists. She'd faced plenty of challenges as the only human at the academy, but being treated as physically inferior was a new low. She decided then and there that she would not only complete the standard assessment route, but she would excel at it. The simulation dome was a marvel of adaptive technology. As students entered, they found themselves in a stark, rocky landscape with high gravity, low oxygen, and extreme temperature variations, an environment designed to challenge all species equally by being equally inhospitable to everyone. The assessment was simple in concept. Navigate from one end of the simulated terrain to the other, overcoming whatever obstacles appeared along the way. In practice, it was a grueling test of both physical endurance and problem-solving under stress. Alara stood at her designated starting point, eyeing the modified route marker that would lead her on an easier path. Next to it was the standard route marker, which headed straight into a section of rugged, high-gravity terrain. She glanced back at the instructor, who was busy orienting a group of aquatic students, then quickly stepped onto the standard path. "Your route is incorrect," announced the automated guidance system. "Override," Alara responded, using the command she'd heard other students use when the system made errors. "Student preference takes priority per Academy Regulation 47B. There was a pause, then override accepted. "Proceeding with standard assessment route. Be advised, this route is not optimized for your physiological profile." Alara set her jaw. "I'm aware." The first hour of the assessment went reasonably well. The high gravity was tiring but manageable, and Alara had always been good at the problem-solving aspects of these tests. She successfully navigated a maze of unstable rock formations and correctly identified which native plants would be safe for human consumption in an emergency. She began to feel a growing sense of confidence. Maybe this would be her chance to prove herself, to show everyone that humans weren't the fragile creatures they'd been made out to be. Then came the ravine. It wasn't particularly wide, perhaps 3 meters across, but in the high-gravity environment, jumping it would be challenging for anyone. Most non-flying species would need to use the provided equipment, a set of extendable grappling tools designed to be usable by various physiological types. Alara was just reaching for the equipment when she spotted the Krillian students approaching from behind. They had been following her, she realized, probably hoping to see her struggle. Something stubborn and prideful rose within her. She didn't need special tools. She could jump this ravine just like she would on Earth, adjusted for the higher gravity. She'd spent months training in the Academy's variable gravity gymnasium, preparing for exactly this kind of situation. She backed up a few paces, took a deep breath, and ran forward. Her leap was strong and well calculated. In normal gravity, it would have carried her easily across the gap. But the simulator's enhanced gravitational field pulled at her more forcefully than she'd accounted for. She realized mid-air that she wasn't going to make it. Her arms shot out, grasping desperately at the edge of the far side. Her fingers caught hold, but the impact sent a jarring shock through her body. And then, crack! The sound was louder than ever, echoing off the simulated rock walls of the ravine. Alara felt a sharp pain in her right knee as it collided with the cliff face. She dangled precariously, fingers straining to maintain their grip. Behind her, she heard the Krillian translators conveying something between alarm and vindicated mockery. The human support structure has failed. Call the medical team. Anger surged through her, providing a welcome distraction from the pain. With a grunt of effort, she pulled herself up, scrambling onto the ledge despite her protesting knee. She stood, wincing but upright, and turned to face the Krillians on the other side. "It's just a sound," she called across the gap, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My support structure is working just fine." She couldn't read the alien expressions exactly, but their crystalline bodies had lost some of their mocking gleam. One of them reached for the grappling equipment, apparently deciding not to attempt the jump that she had nearly missed. Alara didn't wait to watch them cross. She turned and continued along the path, ignoring the throb in her knee and the small trickle of blood where she'd scraped it against the rock face. It wasn't a serious injury, barely a scratch by human standards, but she knew it would look dramatic to the alien students with their exoskeletons and chitin. She completed the remainder of the course with grim determination, her knee making that now familiar cracking sound with each bend. Rather than trying to move silently, she leaned into it, almost defiantly letting the sound announce her progress. By the time she reached the end point, a small crowd had gathered. Word had apparently spread about the human who had broken her support structure but continued anyway. The course instructor was waiting, bovine features arranged in what might have been concern or possibly admiration. "Student Vance," the instructor said, consulting a data readout. "You completed the standard assessment route in a time that places you in the upper 30 percentile of all participants. Despite your acoustic event." "My knee popped," Alara corrected firmly. "It happens. It's not dangerous or debilitating." The instructor nodded slowly. "So it would seem. I believe some assumptions may need to be reassessed." Word of Alara's performance spread quickly through the academy. By the next day, the narrative had shifted from fragile human with defective joints to resilient human who continues functioning despite structural acoustics. It wasn't exactly the reputation she'd hoped for, but it was an improvement. When she entered Professor Kthar's class the following day, her knees still slightly swollen but otherwise functional, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The other students watched her with what seemed more like curiosity than concern or mockery. Professor Kthar himself approached her before the lecture began, his scales a thoughtful shade of blue-green. "Student Vance," he said, "Dr. Glargan and I have been discussing your case, particularly in light of your performance in the MEST assessment." Alara suppressed a sigh. "I really wish everyone would stop treating my knees like some kind of scientific mystery." "On the contrary," Professor Kthar replied, "we believe we've been approaching the phenomenon from an incorrect perspective. It's not a design flaw. It's an adaptation indicator." Alara blinked. "A what?" "Dr. Glargan's analysis of your synovial fluid revealed high levels of adaptogenic compounds. The acoustic phenomena appears to correlate with your species' remarkable ability to function under varying gravitational conditions. In essence, the sound may be a byproduct of your joints' self-calibration mechanisms." Alara wasn't sure if this theory made scientific sense, but she was too surprised by the positive reframing to question it. "So, you're saying my noisy knees are actually a good thing?" "They're a data point in understanding your species' adaptability," Professor Kthar clarified, "which, we believe, has been significantly underestimated." Before Alara could respond, Dr. Glargan himself entered the classroom, accompanied by the Academy's Chancellor, a rarely seen Kintari whose five-fold symmetrical body was said to represent the 5 fundamental forces of the universe. "Attention!" The Chancellor's harmonious voice filled the room, without seeming to raise in volume. "Dr. Glargan and Professor Kthar have proposed an academy-wide symposium on adaptive physiological phenomena across species. Student Alara Vance has been invited to co-present on human joint acoustics as an adaptive mechanism." Alara's jaw dropped. A symposium? With her as a presenter? All because her knees made weird noises? "Chancellor," she began, "I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm not sure my knees are interesting enough to warrant an entire presentation." The Chancellor's 5 eye stalks focused on her with benevolent intensity. "Young human, at the Xylos Academy, we believe that understanding begins with the acknowledgement of diversity in all its forms. Your joint acoustics have sparked valuable discussions about adaptation, resilience, and the dangers of applying one species' standards to another. This is precisely the kind of discourse we wish to encourage." And so, against all expectations, Alara found herself preparing for her role as a symposium presenter. Dr. Glargan provided her with the data from her medical examination, which she studied alongside human medical texts to better understand the actual science behind joint sounds. Professor Kthar helped her develop visual aids and presentation strategies. Most surprisingly, she found herself with a team of volunteers, including Zorp and, to her astonishment, 2 of the Krillian students who had formerly mocked her. "Your continued functionality despite your acoustics was impressive," one of the Krillians admitted during a preparation session. "Perhaps there is more to learn about structural diversity than we acknowledged." The symposium itself was held in the Academy's Grand Amphitheater, a space designed to accommodate beings of all sizes and environmental needs. Alara stood before the assembled crowd, heart pounding but resolve firm, as she began her presentation. "When I first came to Xylos Academy," she said, "I never imagined that the sound my knees sometimes make would become a topic of scientific interest. But what began as an embarrassing moment has led to important conversations about how we perceive physiological differences across species." She activated a holographic display showing detailed scans of human knee joints alongside those of various other species. "Human joints aren't perfect," she continued. "They make noise, they wear out over time, and yes, sometimes they hurt when it rains. But they're remarkably adaptive. They allow us to function in varying gravitational conditions, to recover from minor injuries, and to perform a wide range of movements." Next came video clips from Earth, showing humans engaged in activities from ballet dancing to mountain climbing to spacewalking. "These so-called design flaws haven't stopped us from exploring, creating, or connecting with other species," she said. "In fact, I'd argue that understanding our limitations has pushed us to develop technologies and techniques that extend our capabilities beyond our biological constraints." Dr. Glargan presented next, sharing the actual scientific data behind joint sounds and putting them in context of comparative xenobiology. Professor Kthar followed with an insightful discussion of how different evolutionary pressures lead to different physiological trade-offs across species. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions and sharing examples of how their own species dealt with similar adaptational challenges. What had begun as a source of embarrassment for Alara had transformed into a genuine academic exchange. After the formal presentations concluded, the amphitheater transformed into a more casual gathering space where students and faculty could continue discussions in smaller groups. Alara found herself at the center of an unlikely gathering. Beings from worlds she'd barely heard of, all sharing stories about their own bodies' peculiarities and adaptations. A Hevelaran demonstrated how they could detach and reattach their sensory stalks. A Phosphorian intentionally triggered their stress response to illuminate the entire area around them with a soft glow. A Trilaxian permitted students to touch their crystalline crest, which changed color with temperature variations. "I suppose we're all a bit strange, depending on your perspective," Zorp observed, his tentacles gently pulsating with contentment. "That's exactly it," Alara agreed. "Normal is just whatever you're used to." As if on cue, she shifted her position, and her knee made a soft popping sound. Instead of flinches or concerned looks, several nearby students made their species equivalent of appreciative noises. "Most impressive," commented a Silicon-based student. "A built-in status update mechanism. I still don't understand how it doesn't cause pain," admitted a Grinshaw. "Sometimes it does," Alara said honestly. "But mostly it's just there, part of being human." The conversations continued late into the evening, ranging from serious scientific exchanges to increasingly absurd theories about what evolutionary purpose niche sounds might serve. Perhaps it's a warning to predators? This human is fully operational despite strange noises do not attack. In the days that followed, Ilera noticed a subtle but significant shift in how she was perceived at the academy. The whispers and stares had largely disappeared. When her knees made noise, it was met with casual acceptance rather than alarm or mockery. Several professors even began to incorporate her experience into their discussions of interspecies communication and perception. More importantly, Ilera found herself at the center of a growing initiative. Inspired by the symposium, students from various departments had begun collaborating on what they called the Biological Peculiarities Project, an effort to document and celebrate the unique adaptations and characteristics of different species. The goal is to create a comprehensive database, explained one of the Krillian students who had become an unexpected ally. Not just of the obvious differences between species, but the small, seemingly insignificant variations that might otherwise lead to misunderstandings. Ilera and Zorp took a leading role in the project, organizing workshop sessions where students could share their own experiences of biological peculiarities. Everything from molting cycles to bioelectric discharges to temporal perception shifts. What had begun as a single embarrassing incident had blossomed into a genuine movement toward greater interspecies understanding. The project reached its culmination at the Academy's annual Diversity Celebration, a day-long event showcasing the myriad cultures, physiologies, and perspectives that made up the Xylos community. The Biological Peculiarities Project had been given a prominent exhibition space, where interactive displays allowed visitors to experience simulations of different species' physiological experiences. Ilera stood before the human display, which included a knee joint simulator that produced the infamous cracking sound when bent. Students of all species lined up to try it, many reacting with surprised laughter when the sound occurred. "It really is quite satisfying once you get used to it," admitted a Trilaxian student after experimenting with the simulator. "That's humanity in a nutshell," Ilera replied with a smile. "We're full of weird contradictions that somehow work." As the celebration continued around her, Ilera felt a deep sense of belonging that had eluded her during her early days at the academy. What had once made her an object of concern and mockery had, through persistence and openness, become a bridge of understanding between herself and her alien classmates. Later that evening, as students gathered in the central atrium for the celebration's closing ceremony, the chancellor approached Ilera, 5 eye stalks glowing with what she'd learned to recognize as approval. "Student Vance," the chancellor said, "your contribution to our community extends far beyond academic achievement. You have turned a moment of misunderstanding into an opportunity for growth and connection." Ilera felt herself blush. "I just didn't want people to think humans were falling apart every time we stand up. Sometimes the most important lessons begin with the simplest misunderstandings," the chancellor replied. "Your experience has reminded us all that what we perceive as weakness in others may in fact be simply difference, and that difference itself can be a source of strength." As if punctuating the chancellor's words, Ilera shifted her weight, and her knee made its familiar crackling sound. No one flinched. No one stared. It was just another sound in the symphony of biological diversity that filled the academy. Ilera completed her exchange year at Xylos with a deeper understanding of both herself and the vast array of life forms that shared the galaxy with humanity. The neat incident, as it came to be known, had evolved from an embarrassment to an anecdote she shared willingly, an emblem of the journey from misunderstanding to acceptance. When new human exchange students arrived the following year, they were surprised to find that the academy already had a basic grasp of human joint acoustics. Professor Vance's phenomenon, some called it, though Ilera, now pursuing advanced studies in interspecies communication, insisted the name was unnecessarily grandiose. "It's just knees being knees," she would say with a laugh. "Nothing special about it." But in a universe where every species was the product of a unique evolutionary journey, where what was normal for one could be extraordinary to another. Perhaps there was something special in that very ordinariness, in a cracking, popping soundtrack of a human moving through the world, carrying on despite imperfections, adaptive and resilient in their own peculiar way. And whenever Ilara heard that familiar sound, whether from her own joints or those of another human, she no longer felt embarrassment. Instead, she felt a quiet pride, not in the sound itself, but in what it represented. The beautiful imperfection of being human in a vast, diverse galaxy where every creaking, clicking, squelching, humming being had its own story to tell.